The opposition party, Action SA, says the Western sanctions against Zimbabwe should not be lifted until the ZANU PF-led government respects human rights. This is in contrast to calls by the South African ruling party ANC for sanctions imposed by the United States on Zimbabwe to be scrapped. The United States imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2003 at the height of its violent land reform.
The Zimbabwean government has since then blamed sanctions for the country's economic decline, which has resulted in citizens fleeing to neighboring countries in search of greener pastures. However, according to Action SA, the ZANU PF, which has ruled Zimbabwe since 1980, has been responsible for a number of human rights abuses in the country, ruined the country's economy, and has systematically destroyed Zimbabwe's democracy and led to its citizens migrating. Joining us this morning to discuss this further is Action SA President Herman Mashaba. Good morning and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and actually discussing this very, very important subject that has impacted the people of Zimbabwe in a very negative manner, creating a humanitarian crisis, but at the same time negatively impacting us, South Africa, directly, because as a neighbor, as the Zimbabwean government commits human rights abuses, unfortunately, people of Zimbabwe, the nearest place they run to is South Africa.
Right. Okay, now you have called for sanctions on Zimbabwe to remain in place. After 20 years, is there maybe another approach to resolving these issues? Clearly, it doesn't, will the sanctions be the only alternative, the only option we have to dealing with this?
Well, the thing is, the only way you're going to fix Zimbabwe is to really have free and fair elections so that people of Zimbabwe can exercise that democratic right to elect ethical leadership of their own choice. Unlike right now with ZANU PF, with the assistance of our own government, of the ANC's support, we want, and us as Action SA, we encourage the international community to actually intensify this sanctions, forcing the ZANU PF to have free and fair elections, strictly supervised by the international community, because we cannot allow ZANU PF to continue with the human rights abuses under our watch. As world citizens, we watch human rights being abused in this fashion.
Well, so the thing is, and this is, maybe the concern that, other people have. The sanctions, that are being placed on ZANU PF members or members of the Zimbabwean government and the likes, and of course, sanctions on Zimbabwe also. You may also want to look at, other countries like Syria, for example, that have also been, I would use Syria as an example here. These sanctions affect the people more than the political leaders that are supposedly being sanctioned. And so would you maybe think that it's an unfair way of trying to punish these people that are committing human rights abuses?
I can tell you, if it was not because of sanctions against South Africa, we probably, as South Africans, still be under the apartheid regime. South Africa was actually liberated by sanctions against the regime government. We were not liberated because ANC armed struggle played a role. Absolutely not. It was sanctions against South Africa that actually crippled the national government to come to their senses. And the very same modus operandi is needed in Zimbabwe, because on a short-term basis, yes, people of Zimbabwe are already suffering. They've got no basic food today. The country 30 years ago was a breadbasket of Southern Africa. Today, they cannot even produce maize meal. So at the same time, you have the leadership of ZANU PF living like kings. So yes, on a short-term basis, you might actually think that sanctions will affect the poor people. Poor people are already suffering at a rate that is totally unacceptable. But on a long-term basis, if sanctions are intensified, they actually don't really be extended. They need to be extended and intensified so that we put pressure on the ZANU PF to ultimately concede. And actually what we need to do is ask the international community not to accept any senior leader of ZANU PF to travel to any country. That's why we made it clear as Action SA that
But
come 2024, next year, we're going into elections. So no senior ZANU PF will come to South Africa, but people of Zimbabwe will be allowed to come to South Africa as long as they have the necessary documentation.
oh, Mr. Mashaba, I'm sure you would agree with me that these sanctions have never actually worked. So if you look through, history and other countries that have been sanctioned, or political leaders that have been sanctioned, presidents, their associates and the likes, the people suffer, but it never really gets them out of power or get them out of office. They remain in power for as long as possible. And let me help you understand, or try and put this out the way that I understand it. So sanctions are placed on the country, on the economy, on their technology and whatnot, to encourage the people to get so beaten back that they revolt against the government. Because if you sanction a president, he's not going to leave office simply because he's been sanctioned. So you continue to punish the people so that they somehow will revolt against their government. Is that what is happening here?
But I've just given an example of South Africa. I'm 63 years old. I lived half of my life under the apartheid regime. I started business in this country as a black South African, not allowed to run business because of my race. And I supported sanctions against South Africa. I can tell you, for de Klerk on the 2nd of February 1990 to eventually concede, it was more to do with sanctions than ANC with the AK-47s from Russia. South Africa was liberated because of the Western world putting pressure on sanctions. Sanctions have worked here in South Africa, and they will work depending on the intensity that's being applied. Right now, I think the international community has been soft on sanctions against Zimbabwe. So if they apply them like they apply them in South Africa, I can tell you within 6 months, the ZANU PF will stop the human rights abuses and come to the table to accept that Zimbabweans deserve free and fair elections supervised by the international community.
All right, let's talk about what the impact of this is. We've seen that thousands of Zimbabweans have fled to neighboring countries, of course, including South Africa, since the early 2000s. It's become some form of fortitude for a number of them. What then happens to these citizens who have fled to South Africa and some who continue to flee? Looking at the fact that when the sanctions are imposed, what is the fate of these citizens, and how do we then draw the line? Because there have been conversations about, South Africa not in some situation being welcoming to Africans from other countries.
Well, it's precisely the reason why us as Action SA are calling for sanctions against Zimbabwe and ZANU PF in particular, because South Africa is actually carrying the biggest burden of all the countries in terms of the Zimbabweans running away from their own countries. And I've got a lot of friends from Zimbabwe who really want to go back home. They've got family out there who are being terrorized by ZANU PF on a daily basis. People of Zimbabwe wants to go home. They are not happy to be scattered all over the world. So the only way we can get Zimbabweans to go back to that beautiful country with massive potential, it's for them to really live in a country where human rights are respected. But unfortunately, under ZANU PF, they have proven beyond any reasonable doubt over the last 42 years that they are not capable of respecting human rights, of respecting democracy. We cannot live in a country, in a continent where we still have got despots, almost 42 years after the liberation. People of Africa also deserve to live under democratic dispensation and not to really get people of Zimbabwe to be a burden to other nations in the world.
All right, quickly share with us, what the path looks like for 2024, and Action SA. Do you expect that you will, of course, take leadership of South Africa? Is there likelihood of any mergers? Because I've seen conversations of a merger, between well, not from you now, but between the Action SA and the ANC. Are these things, just rumors? And what's the path towards taking over in 2024?
I want to make it very clear to people of Zimbabwe that Action SA will not work under any circumstances with the ANC government, because we regard ANC government to be a criminal enterprise. We prepared to work with other political parties in a multi-party coalition arrangement. I think if one looks at the political developments in South Africa, we don't believe anyone will get outright majority, but we strongly believe chances of having ANC government come next year elections, chances of ANC coming back are very, very slim or non-existent. So it's a question of parties like Action SA and others like-minded. Let us work to democratically remove ANC and form a multi-party government that can be accountable to our people, stop looting and getting these politicians live like kings. They live more than kings in this day and age, where South Africa today, our people live under abject poverty. 54% of South Africans live below the breadline. Our schooling system, 80% of public schools in this country are dysfunctional. Just now, yesterday, Gauteng is one of the provinces where I live, where Johannesburg is. Crime stats were released. I mean, South Africa, it's a murder capital of the world under this government, because they've destroyed everything that they touched in 1994 when they took over. Our criminal justice system is run by criminals. Our infrastructure, the city of Johannesburg 30 years ago was one of the most modern cities today. They've turned it into a slum. Our people live under terrible, deplorable conditions. When you have government that's busy stealing, including the president dealing in foreign currency, and US dollar, you just right now, I've just saw you displaying newspapers throughout the continent with the Parliament. I'm sure the Nigerian people are aware what happened to our president dealing in foreign currency. What kind of society is this in the 22nd century? In the 21st century. I think this, as Africans, we should not really allow. We need to stand up, and the only way we can take Africa forward is for civil society to stand up. And the reason why I believe ANC government is determined to keep black people poor and uneducated so that they can control them. For us as Section SA, we say we are going to wake our people up, take interest in politics, go out and vote this ANC government out so that we can have a new chapter in our lives.
All right, let's also quickly ask, seeing as you're talking about the way forward and the future for South Africa, what are your thoughts on the proposed national shutdown by the EFF, or sponsored by the EFF? Is this something that Action SA will be a part of, and how much impact do you think this will have in bringing up the desired change that South Africa needs?
Action SA will not be part of distraction and a barbaric way of dealing with matters. We're in a constitutional democracy. We cannot really support any action that promotes anarchy. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in our constitutional dispensation. When we're not happy with government, we then have to apply democratic means. Instead of the utterances being promoted by the EFF, banning tires and closing down businesses and so forth. When they are unhappy with ANC government mismanagement of our economy, then why shut down our economy? Stop our children from going to school. You can imagine, as I've already indicated, the ANC government is failing to provide the proper education that can make our children one day employable or be entrepreneurs and so forth. Now you want to shut down schools. I mean, as Action SA, we cannot support such anarchy. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a barbaric way of dealing with matters.
All right, on a final note, let's take you back to Zimbabwe. I'm going to quote an excerpt of what you said. You said, and I quote, "I'll be working with the international community to have free and fair elections in Zimbabwe, supervised by international observers. Without that, I will never have diplomatic ties with Zimbabwe." You've added that Zimbabwe should have free and fair elections. How positive are you, seeing as the ZANU PF has been accused of corruption and a lot of corruption in the leadership? How positive are you that these free and fair elections will be carried out in the forthcoming elections?
Well, you can only have free and fair elections in Zimbabwe if the international community can intensify elections. And I think the elections imposed since early 2000. I think we need to intensify, put pressure. Don't allow all civilized nations not to allow ZANU PF to travel into those countries. They must freeze the assets hidden in those countries because they've stolen money from their country. It's stashed it in different countries and banks. So we need to actually intensify this. In that way, the ZANU PF will come to the party and allow the Zimbabwean people to have free and fair elections. That's why I'm saying it's on condition that these elections are supervised by the international observers. Otherwise, anything outside that, we cannot allow ZANU PF to be the ones running elections and supervising themselves. In fact, South Africa under the ANC is the last country in the world that people of Zimbabwe must trust, because it was under Thabo Mbeki that the Zimbabwean problem started. Taking sides, talking about the quiet diplomacy. Thabo Mbeki's quiet diplomacy is what has actually created the situation we are seeing. So South Africa is not under ANC, is not a free mediator. We need the real international community as observers for ZANU PF to understand that if they win elections, let them win it in a free environment.
All right, Herman Mashaba, and I know some people might argue that, they need less of the West's involvement in elections and in the governments of many African countries. Maybe we need to strengthen the African Union to actually take its place and do better. But, unfortunately, we need to have this conversation some other time. We'd love to speak with you again, but thank you so much for your time this morning and for joining us on Breakfast Central.
Appreciate it.